Now, shifting from application definition, here we're going to talk about creating the policies as that third major aspect of establishing secure private application access. We'll cover the building blocks of access policies, client forwarding policies, reauthentication, and isolation policies. First, it's important to understand that by default, ZPA blocks access to applications until you configure policy rules that explicitly allow access. Additionally, ZPA uses a first match principle when evaluating policies. So, for example, if you want to allow access to all applications in your organization for most users, but block access for a certain group of users, you can configure one policy rule that blocks access for those specific users, while another rule allows access to all other users. In this simple example, you must also list the block rule before the allow rule, again, because ordering matters there. Within the policy, you define the application segment or segment group, then can add criteria for access. Now, this criteria, it can cover SAML, SCIM user attributes, device posture profiles, client types, define trusted networks, and more. So as you establish the criteria, the Boolean logic used between is always displayed in the policy creation workflow. Finally, you then set the rule to allow or block. Now, taking a deeper look at a few of the policy types. With client forwarding policy, you can create policy rules that define when application requests are bypassed from ZPA, forwarded to ZPA to include application requests that the user is not authorized to access, or only forward allowed applications to ZPA. These policies can be useful if there is a certain application that you may want to bypass ZPA, or certain network environments that you would like to bypass ZPA on, such as a trusted network. However, if none of the forwarding policy rules apply or are defined, then access to the application is implicitly set to forward to ZPA, which is the best practice. Additionally, timeout and reauthentication policies can also be created in ZPA. A timeout policy lets you configure granular rules that dictate how often a user must reauthenticate in order to access an application, or when a user's application session is idle. When should it be torn down? For each timeout policy rule, you can specify the users and in segment groups the rule applies to. This allows you to have different authentication in idle connection timeout settings for different users and segment groups. So even if a user must reauthenticate to continue using an application in one segment group, the user might still be able to continue using an application in another segment group depending on the timeout policy. So for example, you could set users from the sales department to reauthenticate every 2 days to continue accessing applications from the sales application group. However, the same users could also be set to reauthenticate every 14 days to continuing accessing applications from the HR group. Now, using the isolation policy, you can create rules that define when application requests are redirected to cloud browser isolation. This requires having cloud browser isolation enabled for your organization and creating a cloud browser isolation profile prior to setting this policy rule. Along with defining an isolation policy, you'll also need to define an access policy in order for the application to be accessible from within the browser isolation environment. This can be quite valuable, again, if you need to extend secure remote access to private applications on unmanaged devices. Having these applications opened in an isolated browser, where only pixels are streamed to the end user device. That said, it can also be configured to operate on managed devices, with appropriate bypass rules set in client forwarding policies. Finally, inspection policy rules allow you to set up inspection controls for private web applications. Inspection policies work similar to access policies. You can actually reuse an existing access policy's criteria to create an inspection policy. This will allow you to match up your inspection policies to your access policies. Now, this is a very important control to set in place in order to protect potentially vulnerable and critical private web applications.